Welcome, everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, we would love to connect. So on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this conversation. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. We will dedicate the last portion of the conversation to respond to the questions you post. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be emailed on Friday to all who registered. And we are streaming this webinar on Facebook Live. All resources that you see shared as links in the chat will be compiled and shared in a follow-up email to all webinar registrants, and materials are accessible on GLR's Community Learning for Impact and Improvement platform, aka CLIP. Please take a few seconds if you haven't yet done so to create a free account so that you don't miss the materials shared from this session. Finally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. Finally, before we start, I would just like to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Next week on November 16th, we have an exciting doubleheader, starting off with a funder-to-funder conversation on seizing the moment philanthropic strategies to promote the child tax credit. That's at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. At 3 p.m. that same day, we have Reconnecting to the Love of Learning to Accelerate Equitable Learning Recovery. The following week on Tuesday, November 23rd, we're going to be having a rebroadcasting of trauma-informed practices in the construction of the deep reading brain. Information and registration for these upcoming opportunities will be posted in the chat box for you now. Joining you now is Jamie Estrada Miller, Senior Fellow with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Sierra, and welcome to each and every one of you, and thank you for joining us today for GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar, English Learners Experience During the Pandemic, an Emerging Opportunity, planned in collaboration with SEAL, leaders of the Sobrato Early Academic Language Initiative. My name is Jamie Estrada Miller. I'm a Senior Fellow with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Very excited to be with you all today. Today's exchange of ideas continues our Learning Loss Recovery Challenge series, in which if you've been following us, you know that we've engaged in a number of conversations with state policymakers, nonprofits supporting school systems, advocacy organizations, and school system leaders themselves to build understanding of the impact of the pandemic and share that understanding of what's working and what's helping in this important time. We're very excited to come together today to hear leaders in the field of education, both early education and K-12, focus on the experience of English language learners during the pandemic. And there have been many reports recently released or over the past year that have been sharing the results from reading and math diagnostics around the country during the pandemic. Some are reporting disproportionate learning loss for ELLs. And today we plan to dig under the hood more, especially with respect to their experience during the pandemic, which for many involves spending more time in their native language at home and the opportunities that that presents. We have an exciting group of experts coming together, and I have the pleasure of introducing our first moderator, Dr. Anya Hurwitz, Executive Director of Sobrato Early Academic Language, SEAL, who brought together this wonderful group of panelists with me. Dr. Hurwitz has worn many hats in the education system, from educator to school leader, district administrator, and within the education nonprofit sector. I'm excited that she's moderating our first group of panelists who will provide their perspectives on the experience of ELLs at this time, and then share their perspectives on the mindsets that would allow us to accelerate learning for all dual language learners. Anya will make brief introductions, but I want to remind everyone that our panelists' full bios were posted in the chat. Please also follow the chat for resources shared by our panelists. Post your thoughts and questions through the session, and we'll have a Q&A portion. I'll be joining you all later today. And so with that, Anya.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Today, we're discussing an issue that is very dear to my heart and that has major implications for the 4.9 million English learners across the country and for the entire education system. But before we get started, I'll introduce our amazing speakers. Miriam Calderon is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Early Learning in the U.S. Department of Education, where she advises on department-wide policies that advance the Biden administration's early learning priorities and collaborates on intergovernmental efforts for young children and families. Dr. Esther de Jong is the Director of School of Teaching and Learning and professor at the University of Florida in Gainesville. She focuses her research on educational equity and integration in the context of dual language programs, as well as preparing teachers to work with bilingual students. Dr. Magali Lavidens is Distinguished Professor and founder of Loyola Marymount University's Center for Equity for English Learners. Her research focuses on how policies and practices impact teachers, administrators, and students from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Amaya Garcia serves as the Deputy Director of the Preschool through 12th Grade Education Policy Program at New America. Her specialties are conducting research and analysis on dual language education, bilingual teacher preparation, bilingual instruction, English language proficiency, and early education programs. Alicia Moreno Ramirez is the Director of the Multilingual Support Division at the California Department of Education. This division provides information and resources that assist multilingual students in meeting higher standards of achievement in academic and non-academic skills. And Malia Ramler is the Program Officer for the Education Program at Heising Simons Foundation, where she focuses on effective early learning and childhood practices. I am so honored to be joined together with this brilliant group of women. Our focus for today is to explore how we move through this ongoing, very long pandemic crisis in ways that allow us to be honest and clear-eyed about the challenges, the disproportionate hardships different children, families, and communities face, particularly English learners, while simultaneously staying rooted in the research base and our values that very clearly assert the need for asset-based, culturally and linguistically affirming approaches. How can we shift mindsets, those established attitudes that drive our actions, to embrace strength-based approaches that build from the funds of knowledge of children and communities, so that we address the growing inequities and opportunity gaps without creating deficit-minded frameworks and interventions? Deputy Assistant Secretary Calderon, we are eager to hear from you, your unique national perspective on how the youngest English learners have experienced the pandemic and what this school year has looked like for them so far. Would you share what insights you've gathered over the last 19 months and how the Department of Education is thinking about the current school conditions for young English learners?
Yeah, thank you so much, Anya. And I just really want to thank the campaign for the focus on this issue. I'm really honored and excited to be part of this group of leaders in this field who I learned so much from and who I admire, and I'm sure I'm going to learn today. And I know I see already so many credible leaders on these issues that are signing into this webinar. So excited to be here. I guess, I think about this from the perspective of, first sort of prior to COVID. You talk about the last 19, 20 months. I was, also had the experience of running a state early learning system. And so the vantage point of being able to see kind of what was happening in our own state that I bring with me, but I really start with sort of the pre-COVID context is race, income, zip code, ability, home language served as predictors of whether whether children had access to high quality early learning experiences prior to COVID. So we had really a pre-COVID system that was inequitable. And a lot of these same families were the families that were hardest hit during the pandemic, and young dual language learners among these. So it is a priority for our secretary, I think, as you noted, an imperative for our nation, as young dual language learners constitute nearly a third of all children in the United States. When we talk, our secretary talks about an equitable education recovery. Our president talks about building back better and working towards a more equitable early learning system that we center the needs of young dual language learners and their families, what's happened, what we understand that's happened, what were bright spots, is I think is an important part of the conversation today, right? And what does that actually mean for the work that we will hopefully get the opportunity to do through the Build Back Better plan to create more equitable access to high quality early learning experiences in states and build those systems and how they benefit dual language learners. I think I'll start with saying, my appreciation, I know we're going to hear more about a survey in California and the work that's happened across the state, your leadership and others around the impacts of COVID on young DLLs. I think I applaud that work, and it's really an important contribution. Overall, I think we haven't had the focus nationally and attention to be able to really have a lot of research to illuminate the challenges as well as the bright spots. Earlier this year, a group of national early childhood researchers released a summary of the evidence-based effects of the pandemic on young children, on access to early learning programs, impacts on providers. I think they started with a data set of over 300 studies, whittled it down to 76 high quality studies in depth that they looked at, 16 national, 45 state level, 15 local. It's a really important, I think, review of what we know from high quality research about the impact of the pandemic. And one of their conclusions is there is a dearth of research on critical populations, including dual language learners, right, from which to draw from and to garner equity-centered and data-driven solutions. So I think you count on the department in this effort, but we need to be able to continue to center children, young DLLs and their families in understanding, again, what happened, where we are in the moment and this dynamic time, and then what, especially as we prepare for what is to come. That said, there's always so we need more research. We need more ability with data to be able to tell the story. And kind of where we go from here. But I think, there are some certainly conclusions that we know and we can draw from. Prior to COVID, young DLLs were underrepresented in high quality programs, fared somewhat better in publicly funded programs that prioritized DLLs for enrollment, but there was still work to do. We've seen significant under enrollment and a decline in preschool and at the kindergarten grade levels. And so we know those are issues there. We know that during these past 20 months, many early childhood and education programs pivoted to virtual services or hybrid models. They placed a lot of emphasis, I think, around also family support, family engagement looked differently and shifted during this time. So I think those are important things to be attuned to and understand. We know we've also there were, I think, differences again across the private childcare market and families using that system and publicly funded, I think, that are important. We think about young dual language learners more likely to be in informal or home-based care. Some of these providers were some of the hardest hit, but there were also efforts being made to, I think, new ground happening in states with being able to get financial assistance and other supports to providers to be able to stay open, implement COVID practices. I know, and I think it's important to understand those pieces. Really, what we still need to do, I think, is we've shifted back to, I think all 99% of schools are open and providing in-person services now. Head Start is reopening and returning to in-person services. States have received significant, unprecedented levels of resources to be able to stabilize and support childcare providers. And have families be able to access financial supports to be able to stay in care. So this is, again, still a dynamic time where I think it's important to see where we are in this context and really understand what are the policies and practices that are going to be most successful in supporting young dual language learners. So I have, I think it is a really important moment to think about what happened with use of technology, family support. I think vaccine awareness and COVID safety continue to be important issues. Looking at, again, what have some of those policy barriers been to be able to support the caregivers and the families from be able to access some of the federal resources that are coming in specifically for childcare. How can more dollars that are coming into states through some of the federal relief be leveraged for more research and being able to lift up more of these experiences are some of the things that I'm really interested in, and I know I'll be hearing more about today. So thanks for opportunity to kick us off.
Thank you for sharing that incredible insight and perspective, Miriam. Now I will turn to Dr. DeYoung and Dr. Lavenens, two scholars in the field of English learner policy and practice. Esther and Magali, would you please share your reactions? And we'd also love to hear your take on what English learners experienced during the pandemic. We'll start with Esther.
Thank you, Anya, and thank you for having me on this amazing panel. This is such a interesting time to be thinking about both the impact and what's next, right? I think, how do we position what has happened for the future, and how do we learn from and connect past to present to future? Let me make maybe just a couple of points around this. I think the first thing that, as was already mentioned, that one of the things that we knew about but has really been amplified is the digital divide and how that really affected bilingual families. We rely a lot in education these days, even prior to the pandemic, on having access to broadband, having access to affordable services that work well, and having access to the equipment that we need to then take advantage of those services. I think that's still an issue. And I think we need to really be aware of the broadband access discussion as it continues to affect what we do in education. Sometimes that discussion doesn't always happen in connection with education, but with other domains. And so I think it's an important piece to have. As a result of that, I think, a lot of teachers pivoted and said, okay, if we cannot have a Zoom meeting with our children, then we're going to drop off packets of materials at the homes and to make sure that children had some kind of access to some learning. But as we all know, that does not replace a teacher. So the experience of schooling was very different for many students as a result of that. And it occurred to me as the VIDA report just came out about the assessment of the impact of COVID on English language development, that it's probably not surprising that the speaking domain has been affected the most, right? Because we're now reading papers and we're not having this kind of conversation that helps support English language development. The other thing that I think is really kind of striking to me is just being aware, I'm here in Florida, how incredibly different the experiences were depending on the context of the district. So the larger districts had a lot of resources that could help with bilingual communication, with materials, and other access to health services, for example, in multiple languages. but the rural areas did not always have that very same access. So I think the kind of urban, rural, and resources that different districts have also have become a lot more visible. And hopefully that will lead us to kind of think about the English language learners and bilingual learners in these areas as well, and what we can do to support them. The other thing is that the impact is not the same for every single group, right? I was reading the articles about the Native American population and communities and the elders who passed away because of COVID. And with that, the access to language and language revitalization efforts is also being affected. So that's a very different piece that we need to pay attention to, as well as, you know, the groups that we typically think about in terms of immigrant children and children of immigrants. So I'll leave it at that for now. I know that Magali has a lot more to say as well.
Thank you, Esther. Colleagues, good afternoon. Privileged here to be with all of you in this virtual space. To echo a bit of what we've learned in terms of both the devastating effects of COVID, the pandemic on our families, our communities, also to identify some of the bright spots and being able to leverage some of those. My colleagues and I, one of the examples is that my colleagues and I had an opportunity to conduct a study that you'll be able to see and access in the chat around equity leadership for English learners during the early stages of the pandemic. And this was a study in which we asked educators, leaders to nominate others who had high student population of English learners and diverse student populations across the state of California. And they nominated superintendents, administrators from across the field. And that study, that learning allowed us an opportunity to identify that it really takes the whole community, that it's not just the responsibility of the school system, but as Esther referred to, that really leveraging resources during the pandemic, the digital divide, really created an opportunity in a space to bring other partners to focus on equity, to focus on closing that digital and opportunity divide. So that the importance of leadership, I believe, is something to underscore in the post-pandemic era, which we have not yet arrived at. We're still in the pandemic. We had another opportunity to interview teachers, educators from the field, and a parent leader as well, who really included an approach that I think is really important to really understand from the perspectives of families, from those parent leaders who shared with us what they've learned, what they were able to do, what they leverage in order to bring their students, their children, their young learners, their secondary students, learners, opportunities to continue to learn along the way. We had this inclusive approach to really ensuring that we're listening to student voices as well. So the students have a lot to tell us, you know, children have a lot to tell us about what we can do better, what they learn, what they still need. And that's an opportunity for us to, as Secretary Calderon said earlier, an opportunity to expand our research base by working with the educators, the leaders from a whole systems approach. And finally, I want to also provide a nod and an acknowledgement to the funding to conduct high quality research-based professional development. We are fortunate to be able to be in a partnership with the Los Angeles Unified School District in the implementation of the Sobrato Early Academic Literacy Model in grades transitional kindergarten, which is a four-year-old pre-K span to third grade. And that pivot to digital learning provided us that space and the acknowledgement and flexibility to be able to implement and pivot what traditional professional learning for our educators, for our leaders, was being delivered into this digital space. That pivot was very quick. We learned quite a lot about what it takes to deliver professional learning in those spaces, and the implementation in a large district like Los Angeles Unified School District also signals and reinforces the notion of those important university district collaborations, that it's the whole community working together, and the importance of those family networks and parent leader voices.
Thank you for sharing. Our focus today is to explore the opportunities presented in this complicated time for our young English learners, even some that arose during the closures, and to think about the mindset shifts that are needed around what works best for English learners. How do we establish mindsets that are firmly asset-based? This question is for all three of you. Based on your expertise and experience in the field, what is the role of home language development and literacy in developing English skills and learning overall? What works best for English learners, and how can this moment present an opportunity? We can start with Miriam. Why don't you start us off?
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Anya. Well, I would, I think as I think about this question, I immediately go to the role of families and the asset that they have always been, and in really thinking about our goals for young dual language learners, right, is obviously at it, the most basic level, to recognize their home language as an asset, as a strength, to value bilingualism, biliteracy, to, I think, address what is, been a persistent inequity and challenge in our early care and education systems, is that a lot of formal early childhood education is still a subtractive language experience for young dual language learners. And families really are one of our greatest assets. I mean, I think about my own experience. I started formal schooling not speaking any English. I'll let some of the expert researchers here talk about kind of what the research and literature tells us. But even from my own experience, it was that foundation in my home language that I know was successful in helping me acquire English. And it was my family who is the reason that I'm still bilingual to this day, in spite of my formal schooling and education opportunities. So when I think about the opportunity with COVID, I think is, in this past 20 months, as you noted, Anya, a lot of children were home. They were with their families. We know that even when there were efforts to ensure that, we're talking about a number of these families also being essential workers and prioritized for available early childhood programs, there was a lot of fear. Because the COVID was also disproportionately hitting immigrant communities and communities of color, to be able to return to informal work. So for a variety of reasons, many children were home. And the programs that were pivoting to hybrid or virtual, or maybe bringing providing some in-person services, we're needing to figure out, I think, as has already been discussed, the technology barriers, how to help families it feels like, I know that overnight somehow we did do a lot, not close the gaps, but overcome technology divides that seemed really challenging, language barrier and communication divides that seemed really challenging, ways of actually really thinking about really authentic, meaningful partnerships with families around children's learning and development in whatever format or with whatever, intensity or duration that could be provided, to really stay connected to families. And then to also think about, we had to also be concerned about families' well-being too, right? If we were going to be able to get them to, be a partner, then we were, there were, I think, a lot of efforts here to think about material needs, basic needs of families, and outside of the connectivity issues, and to be able to, our families well, and how are we helping them support their children during this time. And so I just think that hopefully it means it's a new day and a breakthrough in terms of how we might think about the relationships we built with families, some of the challenges that we overcame. And really now the new day could be really thinking about them as a truly, as we talk about, they're a partner, but truly a partner in supporting bilingualism, biliteracy for our young dual language learners.
Magali, will you jump in?
Sure. Well, we've had decades now worth of research that really supports an acknowledgement the role of the home language in building and supporting a second language, both in oral language and in literacy. And I would add cultural connections as well. We saw that when teachers were in the homes of parents, the living rooms, the kitchens of parents, they were able to observe those cultural connections. And so this new opportunity, as was mentioned earlier, provides a space for us to continue to map on to real world learning for our young children. Not just young children, it's really pre-K through to 12th grade. And that really will help benefit their learning to connect what they already know, what they've experienced, and also to expand the definition. I think it's really an important moment in time for us. And we're examining what does foundational literacy mean for young dual language learners. And it means more than just phonetics and decoding. It really means to develop interdisciplinary literacies, to see those connections between the science, the math, the visual and performing arts, to look at language and learning holistically and comprehensively in our approaches to providing those opportunities to learn and building from their experiences. It also means that we need to capture, again, the hearts and minds of educators who've observed that and can make those connections more ongoing and more explicit to address the diverse types of English learners that we have in our classrooms, in our early grades and all the grades. But in order to reverse those deficit orientations and to build on what actually our youngest learners did learn, that is kind of the formative assessment processes, in order to inform new learning experiences for our young children.
I want to echo that last part. I think the thing I've been thinking about a lot is what is it that the children have learned in the last however many months that we've under the pandemic that we're missing because of the kinds of assessments that we're doing right now to identify gaps. And I think if we want to shift that deficit perspective, it will be an interesting challenge. So how do we measure this amazing learning that has been taking place in home languages, particularly in programs that are not dual language programs or bilingual education programs? So one thing I want to piggyback on that has already been said is that if connecting to students' languages and cultures is kind of the starting point of teaching, right? This is where learning happens. So this is what teachers do, because that's what our goal is. Then that principle has to be implemented no matter what the context of learning is. So this has to happen in an ESL classroom. This has to happen in a mainstream classroom by mainstream teachers. And so it's a really interesting time to really kind of help mainstream teachers take advantage of all of this bilingualism and the bilingual resources that are available for their classrooms as well, because it's equally important in their classroom to connect to what students already know, and that happens to be for many of our children in their home language, and figuring out how to engage in bilingual or multilingual practices, even if their language of instruction predominantly is in English. And so that poses also a very interesting question of how do we prepare those teachers to effectively leverage that for reading, so we can accelerate reading, right, for our students, and so that we can meet our goals in terms of literacy development. So I think that's a very important piece. And I would hope that as teachers have connected more with bilingual families and communities, that they will sustain that as they move forward, and communicate to parents how important it is that their children maintain their home languages, that they become bilingual. The research on the benefits of bilingualism has been so extensive and reinforced, whether it's cognitive or educational or economic and cultural. But sometimes we don't communicate that to our parents. And so they feel that they should be enforcing English only in their homes in order for children to be successful. And I think it's a great opportunity here to say, no, you've seen how important it is that the children can talk rich language at home with their parents and families, leverage that as a teacher moving forward.
What I'm hearing from all of you, of which, as you just noted, Esther, there's a significant body of research which supports, is that what works best for young English learners overall, and we know this. And what stands in the way are some of the individual, but also systemic mindsets, and our ability to implement what works at scale. So I'd love to hear from you all. What do you believe are the mindsets educators, policymakers, parents, and caretakers, as well as the broader community, need to have about how to support young English learners? What are the equity implications of the mindsets we need? And we can start this time with Magali. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Anya. I think that the starting point is having conceptual clarity about what is equity and what it is not. Just 2 years ago, right before the pandemic struck, I was part of a research team with PACE at Stanford that conducted about 150 interviews of leaders across the state of California. And we found about 25% of those leaders had a perception or a definition of equity that meant equal distribution of resources. So having conceptual clarity is really foundational to begin to recognize first, what are the existing inequities that we have in our workplaces, in our schools, in our childcare centers, and then to be able to act upon them, having that clarity of actions. We're in a very privileged state. I think Alicia Moreno Ramirez will say a little bit later. In California, we have a very fabulous equity mindset about accountability that allows leaders to make decisions about differentiated resources for communities based on equity principles, the need of providing resources, services, and actions to students who need it the most in a differentiated way. So we found that personal and collective commitment to equity begins with that conceptual clarity, knowing where the disparities are, where the disparities have been augmented as a result of the pandemic, and where they need to be distributed differentially according to need, is an important first step in really taking those actions. And the importance of, again, underscoring the fact no one person, no one institution, school, entity can do it on their own. We found also that responding to and leveraging partnerships to develop greater access to those devices, access to important and broadband internet access became really an instrumental aspect of it. And then the connection to the pedagogic aspects of it, pedagogical equity pedagogies to really, in the shift to distance learning, in the shift to providing PD to those high leverage resources and practices that really make sense, that really are meaningful, that really produce results for our youngest English learners are really important, because we yet have not delivered on that promise of interpreting what we know from the research into the practice realm.
Esther, will you jump?
It's hard to say that any better. I think that's really clearly phrased. One thing I would maybe just add to that is that in addition to the conceptual clarity, I think we need to help the general public understand that why these inequities hurt all of us. And that therefore we need to address them, that in order for this whole society to be better, do better, and take care of one another, we need to address these inequities that we know exist. And that this is important for not just one group of individuals, but it's really important for all of us. And I think that's an important part. I think one of the pieces that hopefully the conceptual clarity also brings is this notion that we need to think differently about the assets that children and families and communities bring to schools. And, you know, Magali and I are both in teacher education. It has a huge impact in terms of how we prepare our teachers to see those assets and the diversity of those assets, make space for that as a way of teaching, that we don't reduce teaching to just a very discrete skill presentation, if you will, but we really truly engage our children, high critical thinking and higher order thinking along the way, because that's kind of what we need to support for all of our learners. So I think that kind of rethinking definitions of what we consider resources, if you will, not just in schools and for the individual learner, but also like we've been saying, all of these partners that in order to address the inequities, everybody needs to be at the table, and we all move into kind of a similar direction in terms of improving education for everybody, but particularly for English language learners.
Such incredible comments and insights. I think I would just add maybe to say we need a mindset shift in terms of leadership, and everyone is leading on behalf of young dual language learners and these issues. And to be clear, I think you're leading from where you are, right? I think we're leading in programs, we're leading in classrooms, we're leading as administrators at multiple levels. I think as we think about our early learning systems and equity for young DLLs, I had the experience years ago of being part of a learning table with a couple of states and a technical assistance opportunity, really looking at more equitable policies and practices for addressing the needs of young dual language learners in the birth to 5 system. And I think one of the things that we really we tried to emphasize is some of the disposition and knowledge building sort of shifts, but first starting with like, you to be a leader in this field, you need to be in early childhood period and policy and practice and leading these systems, you need to be a good consumer of the research that we were just talking about, right? To understand these practices, it is no longer, an asterisk, and there's this, and then what about dual language learners? Like, what is that kind of mindset shift around constant learning? I can be an expert. I am a leader on these issues. Often, we are in spaces where, leaders will make decisions. We know how things roll out and decisions are made about resource allocation or policy or learning goals for children or practices that we might implement. There might not be the research expert in the room or somebody that can articulate, right, what we know and what should be grounding this. And so I think that's, we are in a huge moment where I think leadership and capacity, as we think about more our, building our early learning systems in states. And I think everyone from where you are sitting, you are leading, and you are a leader and an expert on these issues. Or you need to be.
Thank you so much, the 3 of you, for those incredible insights. In some cases, as we just heard, many children were able to develop their home languages more fully because they were home with family. That is an asset, especially for our youngest English learners, for whom the research is very clear that their development of their home language can and should be a critical component of their overall language development and learning, including English. And we also heard, additionally, many educators and school systems deepened their connection and their partnerships with families throughout the pandemic, developing new ways and skills and spaces to connect and partner. And I'd like to share a story that speaks to that, a silver lining of this pandemic. This is a story from one of our SEAL classrooms, a teacher that is fully trained in our SEAL model. She has some conversational Spanish skills, but her classroom is instructed in English. She had a student last year who was a newcomer. He had come to her school in the March of 2020. and he had started school the week before the world paused because of the pandemic. He had not joined any online classes in the spring of 2020, but as the new school year began last fall, he did begin joining his virtual classes. Though throughout the whole fall, he never turned on his video. He had only unmuted once to share his preferred name. Otherwise, he had only participated in the chat. In mid-December, he finally turned on his video. They were in their daily designated ELD, or English language development lesson, and they were focusing on the language function of cause and effect. This is content-driven English language development, which is a hallmark of our SEAL model. And they were reprocessing what we call a drawn label about migration from their thematic unit, digging deep into their social studies content. The drawn label is a strategy where a teacher is explaining a complex set of concepts and content through visuals, graphic representations, literally drawing them out visually and labeling them with the academic vocabulary. We worked very closely with our SEAL teachers to figure out how to do this strategy in the virtual context. So it's mid-December and the teacher hasn't seen the student yet at all on video, and he finally turns his camera on. And sitting there with him is his aunt, uncle, grandmother, and little cousin. Within this thematic unit where they're focusing on social studies, they're talking about the contributing factors, the causes and effects of migration and immigration, which was clearly relevant to his family. The family members began sharing parts of their story, mostly in Spanish, and used the sentence frames which she had introduced in that ELD, that English language development lesson, when speaking in English. They proceeded to ask her questions about websites and sources of information, and then went on to explain some of the differences in their own schooling in El Salvador, specifically related to her math lessons, which indicated they'd been attending math classes too. This story elevates the importance of being truly asset-based, of being culturally and linguistically affirming. On the one hand, this teacher felt so vulnerable in that moment, realizing that she was literally being observed by the whole family. And yet her approach was so firmly rooted in a funds of knowledge, asset-based, culturally and linguistically affirming approach, even though she was teaching in English. So yes, she felt extremely vulnerable, but she also felt deeply honored, and she understood how meaningful this virtual learning could be. And this was a newcomer with a traumatic immigration experience who had been separated from his mother at the border and was still separated, living with his family. What a powerful way to forge connections and partner with our families, students, and communities. That is a silver lining. But our charge is to figure out, how do we scale this kind of learning experience and apply it now as we're in pandemic recovery, no longer working virtually? So I hope that story will continue to inspire us all to imagine what is possible during this time and stay rooted in our commitment to be asset-based. I'll now turn it to Jamie Estrada Miller, Senior Fellow for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, who will facilitate a set of reactions and further conversations on the system's implications for what young English learners need and what we need to do to truly take advantage of the gains students have made in their native language, as well as the powerful connections so many educators and families have made throughout the pandemic.
Thank you, Anya, and thank you to all of our panelists. It brings me a lot of joy to think about how the field has progressed, but also thinking about how public opinion and how our policies have changed. I grew up in an English-only elementary school environment in California. To think about where the research has brought us, where our ideas, where policy change, where leadership at the highest level within education on this call, and our researchers here, this wealth of knowledge, it brings me a lot of joy to have these ideas shared with everyone. And Magda, Luis, thank you for starting the chat with your questions. We will be getting to them toward the end of the conversation. We won't be losing our great panelists who will join us in just a little bit. And now we're going to turn to some of the systems policy ideas and challenges, but also opportunities that have come across the country. So first, I want to start by hearing from our new commentators. And so if I could have Amaya from New America, Alicia from the California Department of Education, and Malia from Heising Simons Foundation join us. We're going to be having a conversation really thinking about the policy rollout, implementation practices, but also thinking about how to build constituencies and understanding of these mindsets that are really essential. And so today, the first question that I have for them is, our panelists shared a mindset that language learners' native language and literacy in that language is an essential part of their success in school and in learning English. So dual language programs and other approaches like SEAL are essential strategies for this. What are you seeing in terms of the policy landscape in your respective roles? And what parts of these mindsets and ideas either enable or inhibit school systems to really effectively serve and support all dual language learners? And how do we turn this mindset really into reality? And so we're gonna start off with Amaya from U America.
Hey, thanks. I'd like to frame this in terms of what Magali was talking about in terms of conceptual clarity. So when ELs enter the school system, they're automatically identified and classified based on what they are perceived to be lacking, right? And so what follows is that ELs are thought of from that lens, which often translates into lower expectations, less rigorous instruction, and language instruction that is absent a connection to and integration with content. But what if we were to flip this paradigm and provide clarity around the assets that ELs bring with them and use those assets as a starting point, right? And I think part of that work includes building a new narrative around what ELs can and do achieve, rather than just centering conversations around the opportunity gap. And I think that the pandemic and the recovery from that provides us with that opportunity to kind of shift those conversations and shift that thinking. Data from the most recent biennial report to Congress reinforces that former ELs often outperform kids who were never classified as English learners, but unfortunately those data are overlooked by our current systems of accountability and muted in conversations about ELs. So I think that one way to push against these trends and help move forward in an asset-oriented mindset is to really ensure that all teachers from early education throughout high school are equipped with the knowledge and skills needed to support EL's linguistic and academic development. And districts are receiving recovery money. They have a lot of money right now to use in a lot of different kinds of ways. And so I think it's important for them to be creative about how to leverage those funds to actually build up the skills of the teacher workforce to really meet the needs of students right now in this moment, but also moving forward, because being equipped with those skills will help them professionally throughout their career, because English learners are going to continue to be a sizable portion of our student population, and they deserve to have access to teachers who know how to meet their needs. I also think that we have to invest in the development of pre-service teachers and giving them access to foundational coursework and experiences working with English learners while they're still learning how to be teachers, so that they can understand how those students learn, but they can also kind of start identifying those assets themselves, because they're being exposed to those kids and they're learning from them, right? And I also think that we need to do much more to develop bilingual teachers to help states and districts expand dual language programs that foster EL's bilingualism. And then I think overall, we need to really try to push all teachers to really understand and dispel the myths around language learning, to emphasize that the home language is an asset in the process of learning English.
Absolutely. The importance of educators, it's a through line through this entire conversation, and what it means to really build up our workforce and their understanding. Alicia.
I just love everything that I heard Amaya say with respect, especially to the idea of like shifting the narrative. How can we come at the opportunity that exists from multilingual, multicultural households to leverage everything that they bring as part of their educational experience? I am quite encouraged by the current policy landscape and the concerted efforts toward cultural, linguistic, and racial equity here in California. And more recently, we've seen a resurgence of interest in and support for multilingual programs paired with assets-oriented mindsets around multilingual learners. That certainly makes me feel like our work is even more significant, right, and with respect to how we respond. Our state has carved a large, really long and intentional pathway toward more inclusive multilingual, multicultural educational experiences for preschool through grade 12 students over the past 2 decades. And essentially, we've emerged from the shadow of English-only initiatives that impacted educational programs programs for kindergarten through grade 12 students and teachers. I remember when I became a new teacher, like the impacts of Prop 227 immediately, and recognizing that a door was shutting not only for the educators, but more importantly for the students that we were serving. So I think that as we move forward, the vision of multiliteracy is being more intently messaged. In particular, in California, voters overwhelmingly approved the California EDGE initiative. It's the California Education for a Global Economy effort to ensure that all children in California public schools receive the highest quality education, of course, master the English language, and access high quality, innovative, and evidence-based language and literacy programs that prepare them to fully participate in a global economy. The California EDGE initiative moved California, I think, toward an assets-based approach by providing parents and empowering parents with a choice to enroll their children in bilingual and multilingual instructional programs, and allowing parents to request a bilingual or multilingual program if one was not currently available. Because the voters presented this as their priority, I think it really reflects this idea of this shift that we were waiting for. In 2017, the California State Board of Education also unanimously approved the California English Learner Roadmap Policy, which affirmed the commitment. And then also further elevating multilingualism and multiliteracy, California developed the Global California 2030 Initiative, which sets ambitious goals, including the call for half of all K-12 students to participate in programs, leading to proficiency in 2 or more languages, and for 3 out of 4 students to earn the state seal of biliteracy upon graduation from high school by the year 2040. It also calls to grow our pool of bilingual authorized teachers, bilingual teacher education preparation programs, and dual immersion schools. So we're looking forward to that growth, and we're seeing investments in those spaces as well. Recently, we've also seen a significant legislative investment of $10 million to establish new or expand existing dual language programs to promote biliteracy, as well as the initiatives such as a state seal of biliteracy and the option of new seal of biliteracy recognition programs. Together, these serve as evidence of California's commitment to embracing multilingual learners and creating a well-articulated path to developing biliteracy or multiliteracy that will help both our students and our state prosper. And collectively, I think these efforts inspire optimism and thoughtful approaches in the local educational agencies as they work to refine programs for young English learners and emergent bilingual students, including elevating biliteracy programs to positions of prominence.
I love that, Alicia. It's thinking about how do we take this mindset of valuing native language and really think about it from the perspective of power of biliteracy for all. And then, especially I would point everyone to the tools in the chat. There's a pathway here, right, that California has developed in terms of pushing these initiatives and developing the workforce that you need to get there. Malia, would love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, and aloha mai kako to everybody. It's really a privilege to be with this incredible group. And I don't know that I have that much to add, but I do want, as we're talking about opportunities to build this asset framework into the way we come from the pandemic, just to point out and remind ourselves this transformative moment we're in, and thanking Miriam and the Biden administration, and we're at the cusp of Build Back Better and this unprecedented investment in affordable, high quality early learning. And as champions for early learning, we've been beating the drum for a long time that ECE is an equity lever for decades. So this is a really exciting and also a little bit scary moment where we know that delivering on that potential for equity to take this policy win forward is going to mean supporting the move from policy wins into implementation. And so the question we're reflecting on and asking ourselves at the Ising-Simons Foundation is, in this era where public money is going to be flowing at historic levels, how can we make sure that state and local partners have what they need to succeed with implementation? And how do we make sure they have what they need to center English learners in that implementation across the board, across the expansion, whether dual language learners and English learners are specifically called out, that the filter of how is this going to work for English learners becomes sort of a necessary way that we think about all of it. And as we're listening to our partners, and much of this we've heard from our speakers already, are, I would say, 3 things: resources to fill in data and knowledge gaps, that how do we routinely and consistently help educators identify their English learners and know what their home language experiences are. It's hard to build on the assets if we don't have a systematic way of understanding what home language experiences are and what those funds of knowledge that children are bringing into the classrooms are. So data standards to help us get to that. The second, in terms of workforce support, just sort of expanding the asset base to to include understanding the assets of educators themselves. And that as we go into this expansion, we know that we're going to have a huge need for more workers, and understanding that in some of our lower status, lower paid pockets of the workforce, early care and education, home care providers, family, friend, and neighbor providers, extended learning providers, that's where we have more educators and potential educators who speak languages in addition to English. So thinking about pipelines and bringing them in so that they can be assets for our students, and leveraging the asset that they are. And finally, just to reinforce the family engagement point that's been made over and over, that how do we recognize that for families, the pandemic isn't over yet, and that effective student engagement is going to rest on a foundation of belonging and trust. And so how can we be building bridges between our educators and the community-based organizations that have been shoulder to shoulder with families through the pandemic and will be important partners to re-engagement going forward?
Thank you, Malia. I appreciate the call to actions there. And just to highlight one of them is that it segues into our next question perfectly. Is really the resources now that are flowing to school systems are unprecedented, and they are also, many of them, one time. And so there's an important opportunity to both implement and prove that the research-based practices around dual language learning and investing in that is essential. But there's also a necessity to really bring in more, right? How do we bring in more people to understand the importance of mindsets and these policy shifts that are coming? So we're going to bring Miriam back to ask this very question. And we're getting to the hour, so folks, please continue to put in your questions into the chat. I have seen a couple about how to actually build knowledge and understanding, and also readiness for high school students. So just planting that so that you all have it in mind for an upcoming question. But now we're going to really think about resources. So this question is for Malia and Miriam. We'd like to ask you about galvanizing the resources that it will take to move these key strategies to accelerate learning for English learners based on what we've talked about today. So how are you building buy-in in your constituencies? Is there an appetite to truly invest the types of resources that it would take to really think about moving English learners to the next level? So we'll start with Miriam and then go to Malia.
Thank you, Jamie. I think as has been acknowledged here, there's been a tremendous amount of resources flowing through states, education agencies, and districts, really focused on the public ed system. In some places that is a pre-K through 12th grade system, and others it isn't, but also through childcare, through Head Start, received $1 billion through our IDA programs, all really framed around an equitable recovery, to a goal of stabilizing childcare, providing immediate relief for families during this pandemic, really being able to support programs and educators in making that shift and pivot around what we've experienced through virtual learning to hybrid learning to opening back up. As I noted earlier, I think those federal resources, I think, have been really important to try to mitigate many of the inequities that we know have been present before COVID and have persisted in terms of how families, especially young dual language learners, experience this. So anyway, big lead up and context to say, we, especially coming from a state, we know that we have that this is not enough when we think about the birth to 5 space, as our president talks about, like to really get at some of the more persistent and systemic causes of the inequities that impact dual language learners. We need a significant amount of more additional resources to truly build more equitable early learning systems in states and communities. And that really is the vision of Build Back Better. We are close. We have never been as close as to really being able to at this moment, maybe in 50 years ever, if ever. And so right now it is a really imperative that we all do what we can, I think, to lift up the importance of what these investments and resources would mean to be able to sustain some of what we've talked about in the bill and the framework that passed last week. There's resources for broadband, more technology, facility, investments. We know through some of the federal recovery dollars in construction and being able to address facilities, investing in the workforce. I know that there is a lot of will amongst and a high priority in our administration around realizing what this opportunity might mean for young dual language learners. I think we have to continue to talk about these bright spots. We have to talk about what this long-term sustainable funding will mean in terms of our impact in communities of color and immigrant communities for young dual language learners and families in terms of more equitable access to high quality early learning. And I don't think in this opportunity and resources isn't just about the access and subsidizing the slot. I think it's building the systems that will ensure investing in the workforce and building up more capacity in states really to be able to sustain a lot of what we've seen here in terms of bright spots. So we have to really get this over the line. And I think that means really being able to talk about what the potential and impact will be for young dual language learners, again, who are a third of all of the children, young children in our country. So this is that has to be at the center of this. And I really hope all of us here who've been listening in and all of the great leaders here will be important in being able to connect the dots between this vision and Build Back Better and young DLLs and families.
Thank you for bringing us back to that, Miriam. It's a third of the students in our system, right? Very important to remember. Malia.
I think that's the place to end, that in terms of building a constituency and galvanizing it, for us to remember that our demographics tell the story, that as Miriam says, a third of the children in the United States, here in my home state of California, 60% of the children under 6 have the asset of a language other than English at home. And what that means is we can't get to our educational equity goals, whatever they are, without centering the needs of dual language and English learners. We whether your focus is grade level reading or middle school algebra or increasing graduation rates, we're not going to get to any of it without centering it. And I think it's a simple demographic case to make. And so we can't get there by thinking of English learners or dual language learners and their families as a separate siloed issue from the rest of educational equity. It's a necessary ingredient for anybody who cares about this across the board. And I think that would be the mindset shift that it's on us to make as well.
Absolutely. And then so getting really specific on, Building Back Better would be one of the policies to point to, but Alicia and Amaya would love to invite you back to talk about what states stand out in terms of policies that are supporting the right strategies for English learners, and tell us what's unique about the policies in those states. We've already heard a little bit about what California is doing and what that evolution has been since the 90s in English only. So we'll start with Alicia to give us more insight there, and then we'll move to Amaya.
Thanks, Jamie. And you may know that California is the largest population of multilingual learners here in the nation. Of the 6.1 million students in the TK-12 public schools, more than 2.3 million California public school students speak a language other than English at home, which they are essentially bringing the assets of their diverse home languages and cultures to the classroom for everyone to benefit from. And I think this makes California's statewide response, as well as local responses from LEAs, that much more critical as we think about the needs and the opportunities that exist alongside this rich and unique student population. I briefly touched on the California English Learner Roadmap policy, which was adopted by our California State Board of Education in 2017. And it serves as our compass, our North Star for programs and services to emergent bilingual students, those students who are identified in our K-12 system as English learners. This historic policy sets a vision for English learners to fully and meaningfully access and participate in a 21st century education from early childhood, of course, through grade 12, to ultimately result in their attainment of high levels of English language proficiency, mastery of grade level standards, and opportunities to develop proficiency in languages beyond English, right? It also establishes our vision with respect to the commitment to affirming, welcoming, and responding to the needs of diverse range of English learner strengths, needs, and identities. The policy itself articulates four fundamental principles, which I think have been touched on in this larger conversation over the past hour or so. One principle addresses assets-oriented and needs-responsive schools, which really talks about like lifting up the strengths that the students bring from home and kind of coming out or turning the corner with their experiences in mind as they were learning from home alongside their families. What did they learn? In which ways did they benefit? What are those funds of knowledge that we can tap as they re-enter our system in a physical way? And how can we leverage parent partnerships? The second principle focuses on intellectual quality of instruction and meaningful access. And this points to the comments that were made earlier with respect to rigor and high expectation. The third principle reminds us about the importance of systems conditions that support effectiveness. And this makes us think not only about instruction, but how our systems are aligned for assessment, for continuity, and for response to our students, and also how we're allocating funds. Magali mentioned earlier that we are a local control state, and districts have the opportunity to think really intentionally about how they can best use funds to respond to the needs of their communities. And principle 4 points to alignment and articulation within and across systems. So this reminds us of the importance of the preschool through TK-12 connection. And, I would suggest the preschool, there's 16 connections and beyond. How can we ensure that students receive everything that they need to achieve the goals that they are poised for as they exit their educational experience? So with EL Roadmap policy informing local actions, California schools are poised to prepare graduates with the linguistic, academic, and social skills, as well as the competencies that they require for college, career, civic participation in a global and diverse multilingual world, thus ensuring a thriving future for not only themselves, but for our state as a whole. And what I hope we can all learn is that as a system, moving forward, educational equity necessitates that we center the needs of emergent bilingual students, dual language learners, and English language learners.
It takes everyone. That's what I'm hearing. And then the clear principles and pathways to do that. Thank you, Amaya. And then I also want to remind everyone that we're going to have you join on camera after Amaya's response. Go for it, Amaya.
Yeah, so one state that sticks out to me is Illinois, where 13% of K-12 students are ELs, and it's actually home to the 5th largest population of EL students in the country. Illinois has a very comprehensive approach towards DLLs and ELs, including early identification. So DLLs are identified in state pre-K programs, and the way their policies are designed are really supposed to be inclusive of those early pre-K grades. It's not simply a K-12 system. They really try to think about what happens in the younger years. And they have a relatively high number of DLLs enrolled in their state preschool programs. About 31% of children in their programs are DLLs, and that's a pretty high enrollment rate. More importantly, they have a bilingual mandate that's inclusive of pre-K programs and preschool programs, meaning that ELs must be offered a bilingual instruction program if a certain threshold of number of ELs is met. But teachers in those programs must also hold certification in bilingual and ESL instruction, and we're talking about teachers of 3- and 4-year-olds. They also have very strong data policies, which includes on reporting all EL outcomes disaggregated by former and current EL status to really look at the progress of kids. And they actually continue monitoring them up through 12th grade and reporting on that data up through 12th grade. They don't just do what's required by law, which is up to 4 years. And so they're really trying to get that comprehensive picture again. They also use a growth to proficiency model that looks at interim targets for each student to make each year of growth, as opposed to just looking at baseline achievement levels, which really, again, kind of shows that they're very responsive and understanding of the different kind of trajectories that language learners make on their path to becoming proficient in English. I would also say that even though they have really strong policies, it doesn't mean that everything is like working according to plan, because the mandates around teacher qualifications, for example, to work in pre-K programs has been very hard to implement. And so I think it really points to the fact that even though you can have really strong policies on the book, there need to be funding, there need to be other systems of support within the state to actually actualize those policies in ways that can make them be implemented with some kind of fidelity. I'll also say that Oregon stands out because, well, they have, EL focused laws as well. And they're one of the only states that actually every year produces a report on how ELs in the state are doing. And I think that sort of information is really lacking. I could never be like, yeah, every state, I could look at every state and find a similar report. That's not a reality, right? And I think it's really important to be able to look year to year and see what's going on. And then they identify school districts that are sort of in need of improvement, try to provide them with some support, try to kind of understand like how they're spending their money, give them some guidance on how maybe they could spend their money in different kinds of ways. They also have like a standalone fund that's for English language learners. It's separate from kind of other funding streams in their education program. And then they also have a really strong data system, but what's important about their data system and some of these other measures that have been implemented is that they were done with the input of an EL outcome improvement and advisory group, and sort of that represented researchers, practitioners, policymakers, advocates, who are really all working together to try to identify the best strategies for supporting ELs and monitoring their learning over time. And so I think that to me is an important kind of takeaway from their approach, is this idea of making it a collaborative process and making it that there are a lot of voices at the table when trying to make these decisions about how you're really supporting ELs. And then New York State is another one that's had that has a bilingual mandate, and they created a blueprint for EL success that outlined 8 principles, and then they translated those principles into regulations that already existed. So they amended regulations. So they're kind of showing how you can create a vision for EL success, get the political buy-in to actually make it happen and turn it into laws and requirements for districts. The one thing I will say though, again, is that it did not extend down to early education. And so I think the takeaway from that is, if you're creating a vision, make sure that actually you're incorporating early education as well, because that's such a foundational component of EL's, baseline learning and their trajectory moving forward.
Thank you, Maya. And it's helpful to hear that several states are taking the charge of, not just individual policies, but a clear vision and roadmap that encompasses a number of policies and elements that are touching on data systems, on teacher workforce, on what policies look like on the ground, really thinking about the elements of implementation, but also the mindset, right? What's our vision collectively as a state for thinking about biliteracy and dual language learning? So I'd like to invite everyone back. Before we go to our whip around, I will talk about, I'll raise up a few of the questions that were raised. And so first I'm going to go to Magda's question. And Magda asked, in a mainstream district where multilingual learners, independent of English proficiency level, are taught along with their monolingual peers, some first language literacy can be developed through heritage language programs, such as Spanish for Spanish speakers, which would then build academic language. She's asking, what is the role of heritage programs, thinking back to the question of culture, in effectively running dual language literacy? And this is open to anyone who'd like to jump in.
Well, that's definitely a yes, that it is a good practice to instate. There's been, the studies that we referenced earlier, the National Literacy Panel, the NASEM report, and including California, the Department of Education's Improving Education for Multilingual Learners, all have really good examples of what practices can happen programmatically at the secondary level. Also, with the expansion of the seal of biliteracy, I believe it's 41 states, or getting close to the 50 state level nationwide, that including those courses for heritage speakers, the Spanish and other languages as well, also can make students more, make the high school seal of biliteracy more accessible to students. And also it signals to those students the reversal of subtractive bilingualism that has been part of the course of our nation's history. And that by acknowledging that they have those skills, even though they may not have been tapped into those abilities at the secondary level, also is a really great morale booster, to reinstate biliteracy and bilingualism at those levels.
If I can add another resource that we may not always tap into are the community-based heritage language schools and programs. You know, when we look at where kids kind of are and where they learn and are different languages, it's the home, but it's often they go to a heritage language school, yes, Saturday school, Sunday school in the evenings, and then they have their K through 12 school setting. Typically those settings are very separate from one another, but they could really reinforce one another to further support bilingualism as well. So I think that's another resource that we have that we may all not always think of as part of bilingualism as well.
And I just want to add in, I think at this time, it's so critical that we're building coherence across all of the recovery initiatives. So what does this look like in extended learning? What does this look like with regards to community schools? How are we thinking about all of these efforts across our country and really saying, okay, language is an asset, culture is an asset. So then we're building that and embedding that in all of our approaches.
And to add to that, I know Magda shared, and you will all see that a poll just popped up for you. So please fill out that information, give us feedback to help have us make the webinars continue to meet the needs and share resources that are great for you all. I did want to add that Magda shared at the secondary level, and this is actually connected to Luis Torres's question. Is there a great online source for innovative or promising practices to prepare ELL's students for higher education? And Anya, connected to your question, right? What are some of the through lines in the innovative practices and programs? And thinking about, you know, as at the secondary level, as a secondary English teacher, having newcomers or students that are still long-term language learners, what are some of the unique challenges at the secondary level and also some of the unique innovative practices there that can move us in this direction?
If I can tack onto that question, Jamie, one of the things that's on my mind with respect to thinking about the secondary context, this question comes up, I think, quite frequently in our context. One of the things that that we tend to ask with respect to secondary classrooms is integrated ELD already a practice? Like, are we thinking only about content and content delivery? Are we thinking about content pedagogy? Are we also considering the needs of multilingual learners in those spaces and how we're intentionally building in opportunities to, you know, lift up their capacities and proficiencies in English at the same time? And I'll say far too often the answer is no, not yet. We're thinking really well about content. We're content experts. So I think there's exists an opportunity for us to also remember that we're all teachers of language, and through that lifting of oral language, it pushes us toward, you know, the written language, so that we can build those capacities in biliteracy toward earning perhaps the state seal of biliteracy or preparing for that college and career experience.
And then going to another question, thinking about targeted student support from Jennifer, she asked, what kind of role can small group and one-on-one tutoring models play in supporting English learners? We know that there has been a lot of attention in thinking about individualized student support. High dosage tutoring has been a topic we've explored significantly with the campaign, thinking about gaps that have emerged and how to close those gaps. But let's focus that lens on English language learners. So what's the role of small group instruction?
Well, I'll jump in. Small group for our model for SEAL is absolutely central. If we're going to really understand the research, I think this was lifted earlier around oral language and around language and its role in the authentic ways we use it, we have to prioritize oral language development. The only way to do that is to create multiple opportunities all the time for small groups, for children to be speaking together, not just a turn and talk quick and then back to the teacher on the stage, but really authentic ways of really thinking about how to structure that oral language and to really promote the use of language. So absolutely, small group instruction is critical. Collaborative groups are critical. Teachers being able to understand the needs of their students, the specific differentiated needs of their students, and then address them with regards to the context of learning. So not in isolation from everything else that's happening all day, really with regards to the learning that's happening within the whole class. So then those small group or that one-on-one instruction, the kid is then set up to be successful back with their peers in the classroom. So those kinds of strategies, I think, again, tutoring, can be so high leverage, but is it connected to what the kids are learning? Is it connected to access to the content? What we don't want to see is drill and kill. What we don't want to see is isolated skill-based instruction that actually decreases the opportunities of our English learners, certainly dual language learners, but also all students that have not had the learning opportunities that others have had throughout the pandemic. So it's really critical that we're being clear-eyed about how our intentions, maybe our positive intentions, can sometimes create deficit-minded interventions that isolate kids and don't allow for access, don't allow to be really that asset-based approach that we've been trying to lift here in this conversation.
Thank you, Anya. And I agree, beautifully said. And so we're going to turn to our final question. And this is our final whip around for the group. If you've put questions into the chat, we'll ask our panelists to share. You've seen their information shared before. If anyone wants to pop into the chat and answer that question from Georgina, or we can share resources after the conversation. But for our final whip around ahead of closing, tell us what is giving you hope in terms of adopting asset-based approaches to accelerate learning for all dual language learners. And we have many of us, so we'll start off with Esther. If you can start us off with their whip around, what's giving you hope?
The fact that we have frameworks and funding coming our way gives me hope. I totally see that we have to bring that all the way down to the local level. It has to be both sides. But I think we are at a time right now where there's an amazing opportunity to get it right. And we have an opportunity to step into that space to do it right.
And feel free to jump in. Magali, I see you're off mute. Want to go ahead?
I agree and appreciate what Esther just said. The hope is that we have perhaps greater public will. I want to say in California, we're in a very privileged place. In California, we have policies, we have great leadership at the helm of the department, of all of our other governmental agencies, and we have great partnerships. So it's really leveraging those partnerships that give me a lot of hope.
Amaya?
I think that we have a great opportunity right now for the federal government to develop an inclusive and asset-oriented framework for how to ensure DLL's needs will be met in universal pre-K programs. It's a very ambitious investment, and I hope that they really are cognizant of the role that they need to play in making sure that everyone knows what they need to do to prepare and serve DLLs. And I also am hopeful about the gradual shift to using the term multilingual learners versus English learners. I want to put in a plug that we need to change the name of OELA to make it about multilingual learning and not about English learning.
Absolutely. Malia?
I think it's hard not to be hopeful in the face of leaders like Miriam and Alicia at the federal and state level. And just sort of the tone that's being set about the path forward from those state and federal leaders. So I just want to thank you.
Thanks, Malia. That's really kind. I guess I'll jump in and say, take it up even a further level. I think that, by all means, resources is necessary. It isn't sufficient, right, to be able to address the inequities in our early learning system. But I think the scarcity of resources has really held us back. And so I'm just so hopeful for this moment and this opportunity. And I think that the two secretaries, so our national and federal leadership, we started with a president who put a racial equity executive order for the whole of the federal government on the table early in his administration. I can't tell you the power of that. And to build on to what Amaya said, being able to allow us to set a strong federal framework that really is asset-based for dual language learners and the early childhood proposals beginning at birth, in childcare all the way through the beginning of kindergarten. And then the fact that we will have 2 secretaries with lived experience, right, helping to oversee this work in federal level within Secretary Cardona and Secretary Becerra, and in this historic moment. So makes me very hopeful.
Alicia, if you can close this out, and then Anya will be closing out the entire conversation.
Will do. Thank you. What is giving me hope is the wide support for and the intentional efforts toward leveraging home language and culture as assets to a child's educational experience. It's been a long time since we've really seen this in earnest. So as part of our acceleration and recovery, when we think about current initiatives intended to provide coherence and continuity across P12 for emergent bilingual and multilingual learners, the state investments in dual language programs, universal pre-K, calls for integrated and designated ELD as part of our ELA and ELD framework. Internally, our preschool through 3rd grade alignment initiative and our state superintendent's literacy and biliteracy by 3rd grade campaign, they all give me hope and they leave me encouraged with respect to seeing great ideas move from concept to action. Very excited about this time.
Malia, did you want to say one final word?
I did.
Okay, thank you. Just checking. Well, I'm very hopeful that we can use this time, this ongoing awakening and reckoning that the pandemic has brought forth, along with the policies and, as has been mentioned, the associated resources and funds being funneled into our system to build what we know and what we have learned truly works. Language is the vehicle of all learning for everybody, and culture and language are inextricable. So if we build our approaches and our policies to be asset-based and culturally and linguistically affirming, they do support all children, all students and all families. So I'm hopeful that a critical mass of our policy leaders will work to ensure that our pandemic recovery initiatives build back better, but also initiatives like community schools and the learning recovery will be implemented in ways that are truly culturally and linguistically affirming, and that certainly centralize the needs of our English learners. I am so grateful to have been joined with this incredible group of women. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing your wisdom and your insights, and to be in conversation together. So thank you all. And I know that the grade level reading campaign has ongoing Learning Tuesday events and lots coming up. So hopefully you all will continue to join. And thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.